They want you, but fear is getting in the way. They miss you, yet they don't know if reaching out will be welcomed. So they stay stuck in that in-between space, wanting connection but afraid of rejection, replaying every possibility in their head. That internal tension has been building for a while, and recently it became too heavy to ignore. For a long time, they tried to convince themselves that stepping away made sense. That distance would help them move on. They stayed busy, filled their days with work, routines, responsibilities, and distractions, hoping time would weaken what they felt. But it never truly disappeared. It only got pushed underneath everything else. Something small likely triggered the breaking point. A quiet moment, a late-night pause, or even an ordinary moment where a memory suddenly cut through their focus without warning. Whatever it was, it disrupted the balance they had been maintaining. The emotions they had been holding down came rushing back all at once, and there was no room left to suppress them. That's why everything inside them feels amplified now. There are moments when feelings build pressure over time, until one experience opens the door and everything spills through. That's what happened here. They were finally forced to sit with what they've been avoiding. In that clarity, they couldn't ignore certain truths anymore. Time has moved on, life has shifted, and most importantly, so have you. Even if your changes weren't dramatic or obvious, they could sense it. A shift in your energy, your attention, your emotional availability. When someone has been emotionally connected to you, they pick up on changes long before they can explain them logically. And that realization unsettled them. Because while they were trying to stay in control of their feelings, they started to sense that you were no longer holding the same space for them in the same way. That possibility turned something abstract into something real. The fear of actually losing you. That fear isn't surface level. It's not just about missing conversation or companionship. It runs deeper than that. It's the realization that distance was created, and now there's uncertainty about whether that gap can ever be bridged again. That thought carries weight, and they are feeling it heavily. Because of that, their mind has become repetitive. Thoughts of you appear without warning. Old moments replay on their own. Conversations, laughter, small details they assumed were forgotten suddenly return with clarity. These memories aren't random. They surface when emotional resistance weakens, and what was suppressed starts to rise again. Now they can't fully convince themselves that they've moved on. No matter where they direct their attention, reminders seem to appear in some form. And the more they try to push it away, the more active those feelings become. That inner resistance is creating exhaustion, confusion, and frustration all at once. What many people misunderstand is that emotions don't disappear just because they're ignored. They tend to grow quieter on the surface, but stronger underneath. And eventually, what was avoided long enough starts demanding attention. That's exactly what's happening here. At this point, they aren't only dealing with memories of you. They're also confronting themselves. Their choices, their hesitation, the distance they created, and the possibility that fear or pride may have cost them something meaningful. Those realizations don't come gently. They create internal pressure that builds until it needs release. So now they're in a very uncertain place mentally. Part of them wants to reconnect, to reach out, to see what still exists between you. Another part is afraid of the outcome, afraid of rejection, afraid of what silence might mean on your end. That back and forth creates emotional exhaustion, keeping them stuck in hesitation. This is why yesterday felt like a turning point. Something inside them crossed a threshold. Suppressed emotion became too strong to contain, and avoidance stopped working the way it used to. In that moment, they could no longer deny what was still there, and now they are left with a simple but difficult truth. Despite everything, despite distance, despite time, there is still feeling present. And that feeling brings vulnerability, whether they are ready for it or not. So they're standing at a crossroads. One direction leads back into silence and avoidance. The other requires honesty, risk, and emotional exposure. What makes this difficult is uncertainty. They don't know how you would respond or how much has changed between you. That uncertainty keeps them looping between hope and fear. One moment they imagine reconnecting, the next they assume it's too late. One moment they feel pulled toward action, the next they retreat into doubt. It's draining them mentally and emotionally. But underneath all of that confusion, one thing is becoming clearer. They are no longer at peace, pretending it doesn't matter. Something in them is pushing for resolution, for clarity, for relief from carrying all of this unspoken emotion. And as that pressure builds, their thoughts keep circling back to the same place, no matter how far they try to move away from it. Back to you. Not because you were perfect, or because life suddenly became simple, but because some connections don't fade cleanly. They leave impressions that stay behind long after everything else has moved forward. And yesterday, those impressions became impossible for them to ignore. The memories got louder. The emotions stopped staying in the background. Reality started to feel sharper, more direct, harder to avoid. And in that shift, they were forced into a truth they had been circling for a long time. Your absence has affected them far more than they ever allowed themselves to admit. Moving on hasn't been as complete as they pretended, and what they feel never fully disappeared. As that realization settled in, the pressure inside them started to build again. Because once the heart recognizes what's real, it becomes much harder to go back to denial. Even if they try to act normal on the surface, something has already changed underneath. The silence might continue, the distance might stay in place, the hesitation might still be there, but the internal resistance isn't holding the same way it used to. Something shifted yesterday. Something broke through what they had been using to stay distant. And that shift is still unfolding. They want to reach out, but fear keeps freezing them in place. Every time the thought comes up, another voice inside them immediately interrupts it. What if they're ignored? What if too much time has passed? What if you've already moved on in a way they can't reverse? That fear creates a split inside them. One side pulls them toward you, the other tries to protect them from disappointment. That internal conflict doesn't stay contained. It creates emotional pressure that keeps building in the background. And without fully realizing it, much of that emotional energy keeps circling back toward you. This is also why things may feel strangely intense on your side at times. Sudden memories, emotional waves, thoughts that don't seem to come from anywhere. When something emotionally significant remains unresolved between two people, it doesn't just vanish from awareness. It continues to echo in different ways, especially when the other person is going through strong internal shifts. They've been trying to escape it, staying busy, staying distracted, filling their time with routines, responsibilities, anything that keeps their mind occupied. But distraction only works on the surface. It doesn't remove what's still emotionally active underneath. And eventually, what's been held back for too long starts pushing its way back into awareness. Yesterday was that moment. The emotional pressure they'd been managing finally overflowed. Thoughts they had been suppressing came forward all at once. Memories they had kept buried resurfaced without permission. And they were left facing something they could no longer rationalize away. You still matter to them. Not in a distant or abstract way, but in a way that still carries emotional weight. A way that still influences how they feel, think, and react. And that realization didn't just bring clarity, it also brought fear. Not only the fear of missing you, but the deeper fear of regret. The fear of realizing too late what something meant. The fear of wondering whether what was lost can still be recovered, or whether it's already out of reach. That emotional weight doesn't stay in the mind alone. It spills into the body too. It shows up as heaviness, tension, a feeling that something is sitting unspoken inside them. Not something physical in the medical sense, but something emotional that the body is carrying because the mind hasn't resolved it. That's why there may have been moments where they just stopped and stared, or felt overwhelmed without a clear reason. Those pauses aren't random. They're the body reacting to emotions that are too large to stay hidden. Even their rest has been affected. Sleep isn't fully restful anymore. The mind keeps moving in the background, replaying memories, revisiting unfinished thoughts, pulling them back into the same emotional space over and over again. And in those quiet hours, when everything else is shut out, thoughts of you become even more present. They revisit moments they thought they were done with, conversations, details, small fragments of memory that suddenly feel alive again. The mind keeps trying to make sense of something it hasn't emotionally closed. That's why this feels unfinished to them, not resolved, not settled, still open in a way that keeps pulling their attention back. And that ongoing inner tension comes at a cost. It drains them quietly. It affects focus, motivation, emotional energy. On the outside, they may still be functioning, still showing up, still handling responsibilities. But internally, there's a constant split between what they're doing and what they're feeling. People around them might notice subtle changes, a quieter presence, less emotional brightness, more distance in their reactions. Not because everything around them has changed, but because part of their attention is no longer fully in the present moment. Even ordinary experiences don't feel the same right now. Things don't land as deeply. Joy doesn't last as long. Everything feels slightly muted because so much emotional energy is tied up elsewhere. And then come the unexpected triggers, songs, scents, familiar places, even random faces that briefly resemble you. Those moments hit quickly and disappear just as fast, but they leave something behind. A reminder, a pull, a sense of something unresolved resurfacing again. Yesterday, those moments happened more often than usual. Their attention kept drifting in your direction without intention. Checking, pausing, thinking, reacting, not consciously planned, but driven by something internal that hasn't settled yet. Because at the center of it all, despite everything they've tried to do to move past it, one truth keeps resurfacing in different forms. You still matter to them. Their conscious mind may resist it. Their pride may resist it. Their fears may resist it. Yet something deeper keeps pulling their attention back toward you anyway. That's why their emotions feel heightened right now. That's why their inner world feels unsettled. And that's why yesterday carried the weight of a turning point they can't easily undo. What's happening here doesn't need anything mystical to explain it. Human beings are shaped by memory, emotion, and lived experience. When someone leaves a deep imprint on your life, that imprint doesn't simply vanish with distance or silence. It stays embedded in how the mind organizes meaning, how the heart reacts, and how certain emotional patterns continue to surface long after the moment has passed. This is something many thinkers have reflected on, including Carl Jung. He believed the human psyche is layered far beyond what we consciously perceive, and that our emotional lives are not as isolated as they appear on the surface. In his view, experiences don't just belong to the past. They continue to influence the inner world in ongoing ways, especially when the emotional charge was significant. From that perspective, what this person is going through is no longer just about recalling memories. It feels more like confronting something alive within themselves, something that has been quietly active in the background and has now become too strong to ignore. Yesterday didn't just trigger thoughts, it brought awareness to feelings they had been trying to keep contained. Jung also spoke about the idea that human experience is not fully separated into neat individual compartments. Beneath the surface of personal life, there are shared psychological patterns that shape how people feel, react, and connect. While each person lives their own story, emotional experiences often follow familiar patterns across different lives, especially when attachment and loss are involved. To make sense of it visually, imagine two trees growing far apart. From the surface, they look completely independent, each standing on its own. But beneath the ground, their roots extend outward, sometimes reaching the same deeper layers of soil, responding to the same shifts in the environment in subtle, unseen ways. In the same way, emotional bonds can continue to exist in influence even when physical presence is no longer there. This helps explain why certain people suddenly appear in our thoughts without invitation, why specific memories resurface at unexpected moments, or why emotions can intensify without a clear external trigger. The mind doesn't always operate in a straight line of cause and effect. Sometimes it works through deeper associations that surface when emotional conditions are right. Jung described this phenomenon through the idea of the collective unconscious, a shared layer of human experience that holds patterns, emotions, and archetypes common to all people. Within that framework, he also introduced synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that don't have a clear causal link but still feel deeply significant to the person experiencing them. It's when something internal and something external seem to align in a way that feels too precise to dismiss. A sudden memory at the exact moment something else occurs. A repeated reminder that seems to follow you without intention. A person coming to mind just before something related to them appears. These moments stand out because they feel emotionally charged, even when logic can't fully explain them. From a Jungian lens, these experiences are not necessarily signs of external forces, but reflections of how deeply the inner world and perception are intertwined. What we feel strongly internally often shapes what we notice externally, and vice versa, especially when emotions are unresolved. Yesterday may have carried that kind of intensity for them. Thoughts may have surfaced without warning. Emotions may have become harder to suppress. Certain memories may have repeated themselves with unusual clarity. At the same time, their attention kept circling back to you, even when they tried to move away from it mentally. It wasn't a random shift. It was the result of emotional pressure building over time, reaching a point where it could no longer stay beneath the surface. What makes this situation feel so intense is the way emotional experience builds quietly over time. Every feeling that gets pushed aside, every truth that isn't spoken, every memory that gets ignored, doesn't actually disappear. It settles underneath everything else, layer by layer, until the pressure eventually becomes too much to hold in place. And when that pressure reaches a certain point, something inevitably brings it back to the surface. Yesterday may have been one of those breaking points for them. Not in a dramatic external sense, but internally, where emotional resistance starts to weaken and the mind can't keep everything neatly contained anymore. The systems they relied on to stay composed, to stay distant, to stay in control, begin to feel less effective. And in that space, what they've been avoiding starts to rise again. Their logical mind may still try to explain it away. It looks for reasons, justifications, distractions, anything that can restore a sense of order. But emotion doesn't operate on logic alone. Feelings don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. The heart moves in its own rhythm, and at some point, that rhythm becomes too strong to ignore. From a Jungian perspective, moments like this often aren't random. They tend to appear when a person is being pushed inward, toward reflection, self-awareness, and confrontation with parts of themselves they've been avoiding. It's rarely comfortable. More often it's disorienting, because it forces a person to see things they've been postponing emotionally. That's where they seem to be right now. Not just thinking about you, but being pushed to examine what your presence in their life actually meant and what your absence continues to bring up in them. That kind of reflection doesn't stay on the surface. It goes deeper, into fears, regrets, attachment, and unresolved emotion. When we talk about someone becoming an emotional mirror in a relationship, it doesn't mean anything mystical or supernatural. It simply refers to a psychological process where another person brings out parts of us that we don't always see clearly on our own. In close emotional connections, people don't just interact on a surface level. They activate feelings, memories, expectations, fears, and unmet needs in each other. Sometimes you only realize how much someone mattered when the connection changes or becomes distant. That's because their absence removes the daily distractions that used to keep certain emotions under control. So, In this sense, the mirror effect means that the other person becomes linked to your inner emotional world. They are associated with comfort, validation, attachment, vulnerability, or even unresolved tension. When the connection is active, those feelings are spread out across daily interaction. But when distance appears, everything that was emotionally attached to that person can become more noticeable all at once. That's where silence and distance come in as psychological protection. When someone feels overwhelmed by emotions, uncertainty, or vulnerability, they often create distance, not necessarily because they don't care, but because distance reduces emotional intensity. It gives the mind space to regain control. Silence becomes a way to avoid emotional exposure. It creates a buffer zone where the person doesn't have to immediately confront what they feel or risk being hurt, rejected, or misunderstood. However, emotional avoidance is not a permanent solution. Feelings don't disappear just because they are not expressed. Instead, they tend to build in the background. Every unspoken thought, every avoided memory, and every unresolved emotion adds to an internal accumulation. It's not always conscious, but it creates pressure over time. Eventually, that pressure reaches a point where the mind can no longer keep everything contained in the same way. That's when emotional breakthrough moments can happen. These are times when someone suddenly becomes more aware of what they've been suppressing. It doesn't necessarily mean they suddenly know what to do. Instead, it means they can no longer ignore what they feel. This can feel uncomfortable because it interrupts the balance they were trying to maintain. On one hand, there is emotional truth, what they actually feel inside. On the other hand, there is psychological resistance, fear, pride, uncertainty, and self-protection. When those two forces clash, the result is inner conflict. Clarity in these moments is often not clarity about action, but clarity about reality. For example, the person may suddenly recognize that the emotional connection still exists within them. They may realize that their attempts to move on or stay detached haven't fully erased what they feel. That recognition can be unsettling because it removes the illusion of control they were relying on. Silence plays a complicated role in this process. From the outside, when someone is quiet or distant, it is easy to assume they are unaffected or indifferent. But psychologically, silence is often where the most emotional activity happens. Instead of expressing feelings outwardly, the person turns inward. They think more, analyze more, revisit memories more, and question their own emotions more. So silence does not always mean absence of feeling. In many cases, it means the feeling is too conflicted to express directly. The person may not know what to say, how to say it, or what response they will receive. That uncertainty keeps them stuck. Inside this state, two internal forces usually develop. One part of them is drawn toward connection, resolution, or emotional relief. This part wants to reach out, clarify things, or reduce the emotional pressure they are feeling. The other part is protective. It focuses on avoiding rejection, avoiding vulnerability, and avoiding situations where they might feel hurt, exposed, or uncertain again. When both of these internal forces are equally strong, the person doesn't move in either direction. Instead, they become mentally stuck. They think about reaching out, then pull back. They imagine reconnecting, then imagine rejection. They feel desire, then immediately feel fear. This back and forth loop creates mental exhaustion because the mind keeps running scenarios that lead to no resolution. The more emotionally significant the connection is, the stronger this internal conflict becomes. Because it's not just about communication anymore, it's about emotional risk, identity, and unresolved attachment. So when we say, yesterday made it harder to ignore, it means something likely triggered a stronger emotional awareness in them. The feelings they had been managing quietly became more active and harder to suppress. Not necessarily in a dramatic outward way, but internally, through thoughts, memories, and emotional reactions that they could no longer fully push aside. In simple terms, they are not fully over it, but they are also not fully willing to act on it. They are caught in the middle of awareness and fear, feeling and hesitation, connection and self-protection. And that is why their inner state feels unstable. It is being pulled in two opposite directions at the same time, with no easy resolution available yet.